You know, I've been watching politics for decades, and I can tell you this with absolute certainty. What recently happened between President Trump and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar isn't just another political spat that'll fade away in a week. This is the kind of moment that fundamentally shifts the entire game board, and I'll be honest with you, most Americans have no idea what they're actually witnessing here. We're looking at something that could reshape how we think about loyalty, citizenship, and what it truly means to be American, and the implications? They're staggering. Now, let me remind you quickly on how this all started for the ones who missed it. Omar decided to take a completely different path. Instead of showing basic human decency, she chose to mock Kirk's death publicly, openly ridiculing a man's death while his family was still grieving. While his children were asking where their father was, Omar was posting cruel memes for the world to see. Now, I've seen a lot of political rhetoric in my time, but this hit different. This wasn't about policy disagreements or partisan battles. This crossed into something much darker. Americans from all walks of life, Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who barely follow politics, they all had the same visceral reaction. There are lines you simply don't cross, and death used to be one of them. Even bitter political enemies once understood this basic principle of human decency. The reaction was swift, and it was overwhelming. Social media exploded with one message that cut across party lines, people calling for Omar's deportation. And here's what made this different from typical political controversies. It wasn't just conservatives angry at liberals or Republicans mad at Democrats. This was Americans across the political spectrum saying, no, you don't celebrate death, you don't kick a man's legacy while his family mourns. But here's where Trump's political genius comes into play. Most politicians would have issued a standard condemnation, maybe called for an apology, and moved on. But Trump? He saw something bigger. He understood that Omar had just handed him the perfect opportunity to reframe an entire debate about American values, and he took it. And just when emotions were boiling, Trump stepped in. When Trump responded, he didn't just defend conservatives or attack Omar's character. No, he did something far more strategic and devastating. He flipped the entire script by pointing directly at Somalia, Omar's country of origin, and laying out the stark contrast between that failed state and America. He talked about the poverty, the corruption, the decades of civil war, the fact that the vast majority of Somalia's population lives in extreme conditions that most Americans can't even imagine. But here's the masterstroke. Trump then asked the question that changed everything. How can someone from a failed state lecture Americans about how to run America? Suddenly, it wasn't about Trump defending conservatives anymore. It was about Omar trying to explain why she, of all people, had the moral authority to scold this nation. Now, I want you to understand what Trump did here from a strategic standpoint, because it's brilliant. He took Omar's cruelty toward a dead American and used it as a launching pad to discuss something much bigger, the question of loyalty and belonging. When Trump mentioned in one of his recent interviews that he would meet with Somalia's president and suggest they might want to take Omar back, he was only told, "I don't want her." He wasn't just making a joke. He was making a point about ingratitude, about someone who came here for opportunities and then spent her time attacking the very country that gave her those opportunities. But this wasn't just about words. It opened the door to something far bigger. Most people don't realize what Trump actually accomplished with his response, and this is where it gets fascinating from a political science perspective. By bringing up those long-circulating allegations about Omar's past, the questions about her marriage, the immigration fraud rumors that had been floating around for years, Trump forced something into the mainstream that the media had tried to bury. Now, I'm not here to relitigate those allegations, but here's what's important to understand. Trump dragged a conversation that had been whispered about in Washington circles right into the spotlight where millions of Americans could see it. For years, these questions had been dismissed as conspiracy theories, but when the President of the United States puts them on Truth Social for everyone to read, suddenly they can't be ignored anymore. And here's what most Americans didn't know. Omar's confident declaration that you cannot deport an American citizen wasn't entirely accurate. Now, she's technically right that it's extremely rare, But there's something called denaturalization that can strip citizenship from people who lied on their applications, committed marriage fraud, or concealed key facts during the immigration process. If someone commits treason, terrorism, or certain high crimes, they can lose their citizenship too. For those of you who lived through the Cold War, this might remind you of something. Do you remember when loyalty tests were part of American life? When questions about allegiance to this country weren't considered controversial, but necessary? There was an understanding then that citizenship came with responsibilities, not just rights. And I think that memory, buried deep in the American consciousness, is part of why Trump's message resonated so powerfully with older Americans. Suddenly, Omar wasn't untouchable anymore. She was forced into defense mode. The optics were devastating for Omar. When she appeared on CNN with Caitlin Collins, she looked nothing like the confident, progressive firebrand her supporters were used to seeing. Instead, she appeared nervous, defensive, almost panicked. When Collins pressed her about that Frankenstein post, Omar tried to deflect by saying she didn't have to agree with every word in something she shared. But here's the problem with that defense. The Frankenstein comparison wasn't buried in fine print somewhere. It was the entire point of the post she chose to share. Then came the moment that really showed her desperation. When pushed harder about the deportation calls, Omar snapped back with nervous energy, insisting you can't deport an American citizen. She tried to sound confident, but you could hear it in her voice she was trying to convince herself as much as the audience. And when the pressure intensified, she resorted to name-calling, dismissing her critics as idiots. Now, I've been around in this world long enough to know that when someone starts calling their opponents names, instead of addressing the substance, they've lost the argument. That's exactly what happened here. And if there's one thing Americans can smell, it's fear. What made this even more telling was the silence from Omar's usual allies. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders get attacked, you typically see statements of support, fundraising appeals, rallies. The whole progressive machine springs into action. But with Omar, cricket sounds. Her Democratic colleagues went quiet, donors started hesitating, and whispers about primary challenges began floating around progressive circles. That's how you know the walls are closing in, when your own party stops defending you and starts treating you as a liability instead of an asset. And if we know anything about the Democratic Party, it has no problem eating its own when someone becomes too toxic to defend. But the real hammer fell when Trump tied character to national loyalty. The contrast couldn't have been starker, and Trump knew exactly how to amplify it. While Omar was ridiculing the dead from behind her computer screen, Trump was standing shoulder to shoulder with Charlie Kirk's family at the memorial service, attended by tens of thousands of Americans. The vice president was there, major conservative leaders were there, and the message was crystal clear. This is how you honor the dead. This is how you show respect. This is what American values look like. Against that backdrop, Omar's cruel comments looked even more grotesque. Here you had families grieving, leaders showing respect, Americans coming together in a moment of loss, and Omar was tweeting memes comparing the deceased to a monster. The visual contrast alone was worth 1,000 political advertisements. But it got worse for Omar. Security had to deal with an armed individual who showed up near the memorial, someone impersonating law enforcement. Think about that for a moment. Families are trying to mourn, people are paying their respects, and someone shows up with weapons in what could have been an incredibly dangerous situation. That's exactly the kind of chaos that reckless rhetoric can unleash, and it was Omar's own words that helped fuel that atmosphere of anger and division. The lesson here is profound, and it's something every American needs to understand. Words have consequences. When leaders choose cruelty over decency, when they mock the dead instead of showing respect, they create an environment where anything becomes acceptable. And that's a dangerous path for any society to walk down. This moment wasn't just about one congresswoman, it was about the direction of America itself. You see, what we're really looking at here are two completely different visions for what America should be. On one side, you have Omar representing what I'd call multicultural progressivism, constantly criticizing America, pointing to its failures, trying to reimagine our national identity through the lens of grievance and oppression. To her supporters, she represents the future. To her critics, she represents everything wrong with modern politics. On the other side, you have Trump representing populist nationalism, America first, loyalty to country, preserving what made this nation exceptional in the first place. Trump doesn't apologize for America. He defends it. He doesn't ask what America can do better. He asks what America has done right and how we can build on that foundation. For those of you who lived through the great struggles that defined the 20th century, Trump's message probably resonates on a deeper level. You remember when loyalty and unity weren't just slogans, they were survival mechanisms. When pulling together as Americans wasn't considered controversial but necessary. When love of country wasn't seen as extremism but as basic citizenship. And this is why Trump's framing of Omar resonates so deeply. You've seen what happens when nations lose their sense of shared identity, when citizens stop believing in common values, when loyalty becomes optional. That historical perspective gives you something younger generations often lack the wisdom to recognize danger when you see it. But Omar's isolation wasn't just political, it carried a dangerous undertone. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in our current political climate, and that's the connection between reckless rhetoric and real-world violence. We saw this play out in terrifying fashion at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, where security had to deal with that armed individual I mentioned earlier. This person wasn't just carrying weapons, they were impersonating law enforcement, conducting unauthorized security sweeps in a crowd of thousands of grieving families. Think about how we got to that point. When political leaders choose outrage over responsibility, when they prioritize shocking statements over thoughtful discourse, they create an environment where anything feels justified. Omar's cruel mockery of Kirk's death didn't just hurt his family, it contributed to an atmosphere where some people felt violence was an appropriate response to political disagreement. This is what I mean when I say our politics are spiraling into a dangerous cycle. Outrage generates clicks, clicks generate money, money funds more outrage. Politicians compete to say the most shocking thing possible because controversy translates to attention, and attention translates to political power. But where does this road end? We're seeing glimpses of the answer, and it's not pretty. The difference between free speech and responsible speech is something every leader needs to understand. Yes, Omar has the right to say whatever she wants, regardless of how ignorant or cruel it might be. But leaders are supposed to know when not to exercise that right. They're supposed to put country above petty point scoring, unity above division, decency above politics. This is where Trump showed real leadership, and it's something that gets overlooked in all the noise. By standing with Kirk's family, by reframing the debate around loyalty and decency, by reminding Americans of values we used to share, Trump demonstrated what responsible leadership actually looks like. It's not about having the freedom to say anything, it's about having the wisdom to say the right thing at the right time. And that brings us to the bigger question, what does this moment mean for the future? Here's something I've learned from decades of observing human behavior. Character scandals last far longer than policy scandals. You can survive a bad vote on some spending bill. You can spin a controversial position on taxes or regulations. But when the public decides you lack basic human decency, when they see you as someone who celebrates death instead of showing respect, there's no coming back from that. Every opponent Omar faces from here on out is going to bring this up. Every debate, every campaign ad, every fundraising appeal, they're all going to reference the moment she mocked a dead man while his children were grieving. That's not a political liability. That's a career-ending anchor around her neck. But Trump understood something even deeper than that. He recognized that Omar's cruelty gave him an opportunity to shift the entire national conversation from should she apologize to should she even be here in the first place. That's political jiu-jitsu of the highest order, using your opponent's momentum against them to achieve something much bigger than just winning an argument. By connecting Omar's Frankenstein comments to questions about her immigration history, Trump managed to make millions of Americans suddenly aware of something they'd never heard of before denaturalization. The legal process by which naturalized citizens can lose their citizenship if they obtained it fraudulently. Most people had no idea this was even possible, but suddenly it was part of the national conversation. Once trust is broken at this fundamental level, it rarely returns. And that's exactly what happened to Omar. She went from being a controversial but untouchable progressive icon to someone even her own party started viewing as a liability. The whispers about primary challenges, the silence from usual allies, the hesitation from donors, All of that tells you everything you need to know about her political future. But here's the catch. This isn't just about Omar. It's about where our politics is headed. We're at a crossroads as a nation, and the choice we make will determine what kind of country we leave to our children and grandchildren. Do we reward politicians who choose cruelty over decency? Do we normalize the mockery of death and the celebration of division? Or do we demand something better from our leaders? Do we insist that with great power comes great responsibility? That representing the American people means embodying American values? This is where your generation has a crucial role to play. You remember what this country was like when leaders understood the weight of their words, when public service meant serving something bigger than yourself, when loyalty to America wasn't considered controversial but essential. You have the historical perspective to recognize what we're losing, and the moral authority to demand we get it back. The danger isn't just that we have politicians like Omar who mock the dead. It's that we might be creating a system where such behavior becomes normal, where outrage is rewarded over decency, where division is more profitable than unity. That's a recipe for the kind of societal breakdown you've witnessed in other countries, the kind of collapse that happens when shared values disappear and common purpose evaporates. Look at what happened during the memorial service itself. Tens of thousands of Americans came together to honor one man's life, to comfort his family, to demonstrate that decency still matters in this country. President Trump and Vice President Vance were there not because it was politically necessary, but because it was morally right. That's the America you remember, isn't it? The America where we came together in times of loss, where we honored our dead regardless of political differences. The contrast with Omar couldn't have been starker. While thousands gathered to show respect, she was at home posting cruel memes. While leaders demonstrated what American values look like in practice, she was demonstrating what happens when those values are abandoned. The choice between these two approaches isn't really about politics, it's about the kind of society we want to be. But there's reason for hope in this story, and it comes from an unexpected source, the American people themselves. When Omar crossed that line of basic decency, Americans from across the political spectrum rejected her behavior. It wasn't just Republicans being partisan, it was Democrats, independents, and people who usually ignore politics entirely, all saying the same thing. This is not who we are. This is not what we accept. That gives me tremendous optimism about our future. It tells me that despite all the division and anger in our politics, Americans still share certain fundamental values. We still believe in respecting the dead, comforting the grieving, and maintaining basic human decency even in the heat of political battle. Those values aren't Republican or Democratic, they're American. The question is whether we'll demand that our leaders reflect those values, or whether we'll continue to reward the politics of outrage and division. The choice, ultimately, is ours. Every vote we cast, every candidate we support, every behavior we excuse or condemn, these are all decisions about the kind of country we want to live in. Trump's response to Omar showed us what leadership looks like when it's guided by principle rather than political calculation. He didn't just score points against a political opponent, he reminded Americans of who we used to be and who we can be again. He stood with the grieving, honored the dead, and defended the values that made this country great in the first place. Omar's downfall, on the other hand, showed us what happens when leaders abandon those values in pursuit of clicks and controversy. That's a lesson every politician should learn, but more importantly, it's a lesson every voter should remember. And that's why this clash between Trump and Omar matters more than people realize. This was about a defining moment that revealed something important about where we are as a country and where we're headed. It showed us that Americans still have standards, still expect decency from their leaders, and still believe that some things are more important than political point scoring. But it also showed us how fragile those standards can be, how easily they can be eroded. The responsibility for protecting those standards lies with all of us. Your generation understands this better than most because you've seen what America can accomplish when we're united behind common values. That experience gives you both the wisdom to recognize what we're losing and the moral authority to demand we get it back. Leadership isn't about having the loudest voice or the most followers on social media. It's about values, respect, and responsibility. It's about understanding that words have consequences, that actions matter, and that representing the American people is a privilege that comes with obligations. It's about showing up when it counts, standing with the grieving, and defending what's right, even when it's not popular. That's what Trump demonstrated. That's what Omar failed to understand. And that's what the rest of us need to remember as we navigate the challenging times ahead. The future of American politics and American society depends on whether we reward this kind of responsible leadership or whether we continue down the path of outrage and division. The choice, as always, is ours to make. But we have to make it soon, before the damage becomes irreversible. So now I want to hear from you. Did Trump just change the game with this move? Should Omar face real consequences? Should she be deported? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this opened your eyes, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with a friend, because most people still have no idea what this really means for our future.